On the edge of the prairie, where silence carried both secrets and danger, a lone cowboy did something no one expected. In a land where trust was scarcer than water, he broke bread with the very tribe others called his enemy. Around the fire, they ate together, their voices hushed, but their eyes watchful, as if every bite carried the weight of generations of mistrust. It was a gesture so small, yet in the Old West, it was enough to ignite both hope and fury. For the cowboy, sharing bread was not about politics or power. It was about survival, about seeing the humanity in faces hardened by the same winds and sun that had weathered his own. Yet the act did not go unseen. By dawn, the whispers had spread like wildfire across the plains, twisting his choice into a challenge, turning a simple meal into a spark that threatened to set two worlds ablaze. The tribe had long carried the burden of betrayal, and many within his own town clung to fear like a weapon. To them, the sight of bread passed between strangers was more dangerous than bullets. It was the possibility of change. And change, in the West, was often met with violence before it was ever met with understanding. When the sun rose, the cowboy found his door no longer his own. Warriors stood on one side, townsmen on the other, their anger thick as smoke, their hands reaching for rifles and blades. His home, once a refuge, had become the ground where two worlds collided. What began with bread now demanded blood, or something far greater than blood. This was not just the story of a cowboy caught between loyalty and survival. It was the story of how one choice, made in silence and in hunger, could shake the fragile balance of an unforgiving land. And by the time dawn burned across the horizon, the West itself would have to decide whether to destroy him or follow the fire he had unknowingly lit. The cowboy had not thought twice when he broke the loaf of bread and handed it across the fire. Hunger knew no borders, no flags, no tribes. Yet by morning, his small act of mercy had rippled outward like a stone cast into still water. To the tribe, it was a gesture of respect, a bridge built where there had only been silence. But to the settlers, it was betrayal, a man stepping too close to those they had long labeled as enemies. The night's warmth quickly gave way to the cold weight of dawn. He woke to the sound of boots crunching in the dirt outside his cabin and the thrum of hooves not far behind. Pulling back the curtain, he saw two groups converging, townsmen with clenched fists and loaded rifles on one side, warriors with painted faces and sharp steel on the other. They had not come for peace. They had come for answers. He stepped out slowly, his rifle slung at his side, though his hands remained open. He could feel the tension in the air, heavy as storm clouds ready to break. The men from town shouted first, accusing him of dishonor, of risking their safety for a gesture that meant nothing. Their words carried fear disguised as anger, fear of what bread might truly symbolize, equality. On the other side, the warriors did not shout. Their silence was fiercer than words, their presence heavy with expectation. They had taken his offering not as weakness, but as a promise, and now they wanted to know if he would stand by it. To them, the bread had been more than food. It had been a vow of trust. Breaking it would not only shame him, but insult an entire people who had suffered too long under suspicion. In that charge moment, the cowboy realized he was no longer just a man with a rifle and a horse. He had become the fragile thread binding two worlds that had never sought to meet. And as both sides edged closer, hands brushing weapons, he understood that the West had given him no choice. He would either prove himself worthy of both, or be crushed by the fury of all. The standoff stretched into silence, broken only by the wind dragging dust across the ground. The cowboy's heart pounded, yet his voice, when it came, was steady. He spoke first to his own townsmen, reminding them of nights when hunger had forced them to depend on the kindness of strangers, of winters when survival had come not from pride, but from shared bread. His words cut through their anger. For every man there carried memories of desperation. Then he turned to the warriors, his gaze unwavering. He spoke not as a settler, but as a man who had chosen to sit by their fire, to eat from their hand, and to share what was his. He told them he had not given bread for pity, but for respect. If you stand at my door, he said, you stand not as beggars, but as brothers. The words, simple and raw, shifted the air. Murmurs rippled through both sides. But suspicion was not so easily erased. A man from town spat into the dirt, demanding to know why he would risk their safety for people who had taken lives before. His challenge was sharp, his tone filled with venom. The cowboy did not flinch. "Blood has been spilled on both sides," he answered. "But if we feed hate, as we do hunger, then none of us will live long enough to tell our stories." The warriors stirred at his defiance. Among them, an elder stepped forward, his face lined with years of struggle. He raised his hand, silencing the whispers. His voice, low and deliberate, carried across the tension. "You gave bread where others gave bullets. We came to see if your courage ends with crumbs. Today, we see it as not." His words struck harder than steel, and the crowd fell quiet. For a fleeting moment, it seemed peace might hold. But as the cowboy looked at the two groups before him, he knew the West would not let such fragile harmony stand untested. The clash of worlds had only just begun, and though dawn had passed, the true storm was still rising. The uneasy silence after the elder's words did not last. Fear is a fire that needs little fuel, and soon the settlers began to mutter again. They spoke of raids from years past, of children buried too soon, of scars that bread could not erase. Each memory sharpened their anger, and in their eyes, the cowboy was no longer a neighbor. He was a traitor daring to blur lines drawn in blood. The tribe, too, felt the tension rise. Warriors shifted, their hands resting on spears, unwilling to be humiliated at another man's doorstep. They had come to honor his gesture, but honor cut both ways. If the townsman insulted them again, blood would answer. The cowboy stood in the middle of it all, sweat on his brow, knowing that one spark, one word too sharp, could ignite the kind of fire no rain would quench. He raised his lantern high, its flame flickering in the wind, and forced his voice above the noise. "I will not choose sides," he declared. "This land is wide enough for all of us, but only if we stop letting the dead write the lives of the living." His words, bold and dangerous, struck at the root of the hatred that had shaped both worlds. He knew he risked rejection from both, yet he also knew silence would destroy them all. For a moment, the crowd stilled. Eyes shifted from one another to the flame in his hand, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that one man's defiance had stopped the tide of violence, if only for a breath. Yet in that fragile pause, the cowboy realized something deeper. Bread might have opened a door, but it was courage alone that could keep it from slamming shut. When the tribesmen finally turned away, their departure was slow, deliberate, a warning left hanging in the air. The settlers dispersed too, but not without bitter words thrown at his back. Alone at his door, the cowboy felt the weight of two worlds pressing against his shoulders, heavier than any saddle he had ever carried. The West had marked him, and there would be no turning back. The following nights were restless. Lantern lights spilled across his cabin walls as the cowboy sat awake, hearing every howl of the wind like a threat. In town, men no longer tipped their hats when he passed. They spat, muttered curses, and warned him that his sympathy would cost lives. Yet he also knew the tribe watched him from the ridge, testing whether his fire was steady or if it had already burned out. The cowboy's isolation grew, but so did his resolve. He spent his days working the land, his nights sharpening both his rifle and his conviction. He knew the test was coming, though he could not predict from which side it would strike. The Old West had no patience for men who stood in the middle. Sooner or later, it forced you to pick. It came one evening when a group of young men from town rode out to his cabin. Their faces were hard, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They told him he had a choice: renounce the tribe and prove his loyalty, or be cast out as a traitor. Their words were sharp, laced with the kind of hate that leaves no room for compromise. The cowboy stood silent for a long moment, his hand brushing the lantern at his side. Then, with a voice low but steady, he answered, "A man's worth isn't measured by who he hates, but by what he dares to stand for. If that makes me less in your eyes, then I'll carry it." His defiance sent a ripple through the night. The young men glared, but none dared raise their rifles. As they rode away, their threats hanging in the air, the cowboy knew the storm had only just begun. Bread had opened the door, words had held the peace, but blood, he feared, might soon test whether two worlds could ever truly meet at the same table. The threats from the townsmen were not idle. Within days, rumors spread that they planned to drive the tribe farther west, away from the rivers and hunting grounds, away from any chance of survival. Old wounds reopened, and bitterness turned into plans for violence. The cowboy, caught between both sides, knew that if he did nothing, dawn would bring only blood. He rode to the ridge where the tribe had camped, his horse weary, but his voice resolute. The warriors watched him approach with suspicion, their hands near their weapons, but the elder stepped forward. "Why do you come?" he asked. The cowboy met his gaze without flinching. "Because war is coming, and if it comes, neither your people nor mine will survive it whole. We can meet it with rifles, or we can meet it with bread." The words struck something deep. The warriors murmured, some scoffing, others listening in silence. Bread had once been a gesture, a promise. Now it was a symbol. The cowboy knew he had no authority among them. Yet he offered his voice as the only bridge left standing. His defiance was not for himself, but for the chance that the land could hold more than hatred. The elder studied him, his eyes dark with memory. Finally, he nodded. "If your people raise weapons, we will answer. But if you hold your ground for peace, then we will meet you there." The cowboy bowed his head, knowing the burden now lay heavier on his shoulders than ever before. As he rode back to town, the horizon burned with the last light of day. He felt the west watching him, testing him, as though the land itself had placed him between two worlds, daring him to prove whether a single man could hold back the tide of hate. The night before the clash, the cowboy sat outside his cabin, lantern burning beside him. Its flame flickered in the wind, fragile yet unyielding, much like the hope he carried. Inside, his rifle lay loaded, yet he prayed he would not need it. He thought of the bread he had shared, the silence that had followed, and the storm that had grown from a single act of kindness. At dawn, the townsmen gathered at his door. Their faces were twisted with anger, their voices filled with the certainty of men convinced they were protecting their own. Behind them, the tribe appeared as well, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. Two worlds, armed and furious, met at the cowboy's doorstep. The very image he had feared now stood before him. The first shout came from the settlers, demanding that the tribe leave or face fire. The warriors answered with silence, their weapons raised, their eyes unblinking. The cowboy stood between them, lantern in hand, its glow pale against the morning light, yet steady enough to remind them why they were there. "Look at this flame," he said, his voice rising above the noise. "It feeds on oil, but it endures because it refuses to die. We could be like this flame, small but unyielding, or we can be like the wind that tries to snuff it out, destroying everything it touches. Choose now what you will be." His words carried like thunder, and for a moment, the crowd faltered. But the West was not so easily swayed. One rifle clicked, another hand tightened on a spear, and the cowboy knew that the choice would not be made by words alone. The next breath would decide whether his lantern became a symbol of unity, or the light that flickered as war began at his very door. The moment hung in the air, fragile as glass. Every man on both sides seemed to wait for someone else to move first. The settlers' rifles gleamed in the morning light, while the tribe's spears and bows stood ready, their silence sharper than any shout. The cowboy, standing between them, felt the weight of 100 lives pressing on his shoulders. One wrong step, one careless spark, and the prairie would be stained with blood before the sun rose high. It was a young settler who broke the silence. Fear in his eyes, he raised his rifle too quickly, the barrel catching the light. A gasp rippled through the crowd, and in an instant, warriors drew their bows taut, ready to strike. The cowboy moved without thinking. He stepped forward, lantern lifted high, placing himself between the trembling boy and the warrior's deadly aim. His voice thundered across the valley. "If you fire through me first." The audacity of his stand shook them both. The boy froze, sweat dripping down his temple, while the warriors hesitated, stunned by the cowboy's defiance. In that fragile pause, the cowboy's lantern flame wavered but did not die, its light casting a glow across faces hardened by fear. That flame became more than fire. It was the only thread holding two worlds from tearing apart. The elder of the tribe stepped forward then, lowering his weapon. "No blood has fallen yet," he said, his voice steady. And perhaps it does not need to. His words rippled through his people, many lowering their weapons reluctantly, though their eyes still burned with distrust. The settlers, unsettled by the tribe's discipline, lowered their rifles slowly, unease crawling through their ranks. The standoff broke, but the tension did not vanish. Both sides stepped back, retreating a few paces, leaving the cowboy alone at his door, lantern still glowing. For the first time, they saw him not as a traitor or an outsider, but as a man willing to stand where none else dared. Yet deep inside, the cowboy knew this was not peace. It was a pause, a fragile moment borrowed from the storm still looming. That night, the cowboy sat in silence, the lantern burning beside him. The prairie winds whispered through the cracks of his cabin, carrying with them the weight of what had been prevented and the shadows of what was still to come. He knew both sides had only stepped back, not given in. Tomorrow, or the day after, fear might sharpen again into steel. He had bought time, nothing more. But even borrowed time could change hearts. Children from town crept to his door, asking questions with wide, curious eyes. Why had he stood in front of the rifles? Why had he risked his life for people they were told to hate? He knelt, lantern in hand, and told them the truth. Because hate starves us, but bread feeds us all. His words carried more power than he knew, for innocents often heard truths that hardened men refused to believe. Across the ridge, in the tribe's camp, the elders spoke of the cowboy's defiance. Warriors argued among themselves. Some saw him as reckless, others as honorable. The elder silenced them with a single sentence. He risked his blood to keep ours from spilling. That is more than any of you have done. And in those words, respect for the cowboy deepened, even among the fiercest doubters. Meanwhile, the townsmen whispered in the saloon, their voices laced with unease. Some still called him traitor, but others admitted the truth, that he had stopped a war none of them truly wanted to fight. Their pride burned, but even pride could not erase the memory of his stand. The image of the cowboy, lantern raised, flame trembling but alive, haunted them in ways bullets never could. The West was changing, though slowly, painfully, like a horse learning to trust a rider's hand. And at its center stood one man who had dared to break bread and hold a flame. He did not know if he could carry the weight of two worlds forever, but he knew one thing. The story had outgrown him. The lantern now belonged to everyone who had seen its light, and it would either guide them to peace or burn with them in war. Days passed, and though weapons were lowered, wounds remained raw. Both town and tribe lingered in the shadow of mistrust, their people whispering of betrayal at every turn. The cowboy felt it in every stare, eyes that questioned, eyes that condemned, and eyes that silently hoped his flame would not go out. He walked a narrow path, each step heavy with the knowledge that if he faltered, all would fall with him. The test came at dusk, when smoke rose again on the horizon, not from settlers, nor from the tribe, but from a band of raiders who fed on chaos. They had heard the whispers of division and came to exploit it. By nightfall, they descended on the valley, ruthless and hungry, threatening to tear apart what little thread of peace remained. The townsmen rushed to defend their homes, shouting for the tribe to leave them to their fate. The tribe, insulted, prepared to turn away, unwilling to die for those who scorned them. The raiders laughed, sensing victory in the fracture of two worlds. But the cowboy stood in the center once more, lantern raised, its glow faint against the smoke-filled sky. This fight is not theirs or yours. It is ours, he shouted. If we fall divided, we lose everything. If we stand together, we prove that bread was not wasted. His words cut through fear like thunder. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, the elders stepped forward, his warriors aligning beside him. Across the field, one settler lowered his rifle, then another. Against instinct, against years of hate, they stood shoulder to shoulder. When the raiders struck, they did not find two enemies. They found one force. Rifles cracked beside arrows, settlers fighting alongside warriors, the cowboy's lantern burning like a beacon through the smoke. The West had never seen such a thing, two worlds clashing not with each other, but against a greater darkness. The battle stretched long into the night. The raiders, expecting an easy victory, faltered under the fury of unity. Every strike from the settlers was answered by the tribe's precision, every wound shielded by the courage of those who had once doubted one another. And at the heart of it all stood the cowboy, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other, refusing to let the flame die. By dawn, the valley lay silent. The raiders were gone, their pride shattered, their dead scattered across the plains. Exhausted, bruised, and bloodied, the survivors stood together, their eyes meeting not as strangers, but as comrades. The ground that had once threatened to divide them had now bound them in a way no treaty or promise could. The townsmen, still trembling from the night's fight, turned to the cowboy with something new in their eyes. Not judgment, not suspicion, but respect. The tribe, too, bowed their heads, their silence no longer heavy with scorn, but filled with gratitude. The cowboy had not chosen one side over the other. He had chosen both, and in doing so, had saved them all. In that fragile dawn, the lantern's flame still burned, though its oil was nearly gone. It had lasted through the longest night, its light refusing to fade. To those who stood in its glow, it became more than fire. It became a symbol of what was possible when courage overcame hate. For the first time, two worlds saw themselves not as enemies, but as parts of the same story. And so, the legend spread. The cowboy who broke bread with the tribe, and by dawn, faced two worlds clashing at his door. A man who carried a lantern against the darkest storm, and proved that even in the unforgiving West, one act of mercy could ignite a fire strong enough to change everything. In the unforgiving silence of the West, where survival often demanded division, one cowboy proved that a single loaf of bread could become more powerful than a rifle. What began as a simple act of kindness ignited storms of anger, suspicion, and fear. Yet through every threat and every standoff, he carried a lantern whose flame never surrendered to the darkness. That flame was not just fire. It was defiance, a symbol that unity could exist even in a land carved by hate. The clash at his door revealed the truth. Two worlds have been bound by centuries of mistrust. Yet in the face of a greater enemy, they discovered that together they were stronger than either had ever been alone. The settlers who once spat at his feet now stood shoulder to shoulder with the tribe they had feared. And the tribe who once doubted his courage bowed their heads in respect, for he had risked his life not once, but countless times, to prove his word. His story forces us to ask a question that still matters today. How often do we let fear dictate who we call enemy? How many chances for peace have we lost because we refuse to share our bread? The cowboy's legacy reminds us that change rarely begins with grand gestures. It begins with one small act of mercy, one choice to see humanity where others see only threat. He became more than a man caught between two worlds. He became the bridge they needed, the proof that courage is not found in choosing sides, but in choosing truth. His lantern, fragile yet enduring, shines as a reminder that even in the harshest lands, the smallest flame can guide nations through their darkest hours. And though the West is long gone, the lesson remains timeless. Peace is never given. It is made, fought for, and carried by those who dare to stand alone until others follow. And if this story has left a mark on you, let it live on beyond this moment. Keep this flame burning by subscribing to the channel, leaving your thoughts in the comments, and sharing your voice with others. Just as his lantern lit the night for two divided worlds, your presence here helps carry these stories forward so that their light never fades.